In this video, we're going to have a look at the latest super zoom lens from Nikon, which is the Nikon Z 24-200 VR lens. And we are also going to do some comparison with the Nikon AFS 28-300 VR lens. Kia ora, good morning everyone, Richard here. Welcome back to the channel. So in today's video, we are going to have a look at the Nikon 24-200 f4-6.3 VR lens. I know a lot of you guys have been waiting for this lens for quite a while, because some of you have been waiting for an all-in-one lens that is great for travel, and this lens could be the best travel zoom lens for your Nikon Z camera. Unfortunately, right now, because of the COVID virus, I couldn't actually do much travel, so I'm not going to share with you any travel photos that I shot with this lens. When it was back in the DSLR days, when I bought my full-frame Nikon DSLR camera, I bought the Nikon AFS 28-300 lens pretty much as soon as after it was announced, because I have been waiting for a super zoom lens that I can take with me for travel. So the AFS 28-300 lens, I bought one myself. This is not my one, this is a lens I borrowed from Nikon, and I took it with me and traveled to many different places and also some other countries, and I shot many photos with the 28-300 lens. While the super zoom lens definitely have limitations compared to the other prime lens or the other shorter zoom lenses, I just really love that I can just carry one lens and it can do pretty much everything for me, which make it a very good choice when you are traveling around and you don't want to carry too much stuff. So in this video, I'm going to have a look at the performance of this 24-200 super zoom lens and also do a bit of comparison with the older 28-300 lens, just to see what Nikon has changed or improved with this latest super zoom lens compared to the previous one that they create. And for some of you guys who actually already have a 28-300, maybe you can consider whether it's worth it or not to upgrade to the new one, or you have been looking at both these two lenses but not too sure which one would be better for you. Hopefully the results that I'm going to share with you in this video would help you make your decision a little bit better. Before we go and start looking at the image quality and also the build quality and design of these two lenses, there are two main differences between these two lenses. One is this 24-200 is designed for Z camera, so you can only use it on the newer mirrorless Z camera, while the 28-300 was designed for DSLR camera, the Nikon's F mount camera, so you could use it on the DSLR or you can use the FTZ adapter and then use it on the newer Nikon Z mirrorless camera. And then the other thing is the difference is the focal length range. This 24-200 can go a little bit wider, 24 versus the 28mm of this lens, but on the telephoto end, it can only go up to 200 instead of 300. So here are some sample photos I shot at the widest and also the longest, and with each of these two lenses, so you can see what is the difference. I have mentioned quite a few times before that for a normal standard zoom lens and also a super zoom lens, the wide end, I would much prefer to have a wider wide end. Even I have to give up a bit of telephoto ends, because for the telephoto end I can crop a little bit if the maximum focal length is not long enough, because most of the camera we have these days have at least like around 20 megapixel, 24 megapixel. So even if you crop like 20% or so, you still have plenty of resolution. While the wide end, if it's not wide enough and if you want to go wider, then it would be quite a bit more trouble. You probably have to take multiple photos and then merge them together, which is harder to do. You have to go through post-processing, you have to line it up perfectly, and sometimes it's not really possible if you have a lot of objects that is moving in the scene. So between these two lenses, I definitely prefer the 24-200's focal length, even though it loses 100mm on the telephoto end. Okay, now let's have a look at the design and build quality of these two lenses. The size of the 24-200 lens is pretty compact. It's not a big lens at all, look at it, and the size is actually very similar to the older 28-300 lens, at least if you look at it this way. But this new lens is using a 67mm front filter thread, while the old one is 77mm. So if you look at this way, you can notice the older 28-300 lens is actually quite a bit more chunkier, bigger than the newer 24-200 lens, and also the weight of this lens is also quite a bit lighter than the 28-300 lens. It is about 30% lighter than the 28-300 lens. So for travel lens, that 30% weight difference could be quite a bit of advantage compared to the older 28-300 lens. And while the 28-300 lens, there are a couple of different switches and also the focus scale window here. The new lens, it is a lot simpler. There's only one switch here for you to lock the lens at the wide end, which I find actually is not really needed. I don't find the lens would have any lens creep even when I hold it down. So yeah, it's good to have it there, but it's not really needed. But other than that, there's no switches at all. If you want to turn off the VR, you have to change it from the camera body rather than just directly from the lens. And also there's no different VR mode that you can choose from the lens itself. So yeah, there's a bit of difference between this new lens and the older design. The zoom ring feels reasonably smooth when you are turning it, and also the lens would extend quite a bit when you are fully zoomed in, just like the 28-300 lens. The lens does feel a little bit more plasticky if you compare to the much heavier 28-300 lens. But having said that, it still has the metal mount here with the rubber seal around here to give you some weather protection. So I think most people should be pretty happy with the build quality of this 24-200 lens. The autofocus with this 24-200 lens is reasonably fast and also very quiet. And when you are using it in the continuous autofocus mode, or when you are recording video in continuous autofocus mode, the autofocus operation when it's doing the tracking is very smooth. I remember when I bought this 28-300 lens back probably 10 years or so ago. Back then I thought the autofocus is very quiet and also very smooth, but now when I use it again, especially when I use it side by side with this new 24-200 lens, I suddenly noticed the autofocus noise from this lens is actually quite noticeable. It's definitely a lot louder than the new lens, and also the overall the autofocus operation is definitely nowhere as smooth as the new 24-200 lens. Especially when I'm shooting video, the new lens 24-200 would be a much better choice if you want to do a bit of video shooting. Next, let's have a look at the image quality, and let's start from the image sharpness. Because these two lenses have slightly different focal length range, so what I did is I did two tests, one at the wide end and I picked 28mm because that's the widest that both lenses can do, and the other one is at the telephoto end and I picked 200mm because that's the longest that both lenses can zoom into. So let's first look at the result at the 28mm focal length. With the 24-200 lens at 28mm, at the maximum aperture, it is already very good in terms of center sharpness. So even when I stop down to f5.6, the center sharpness actually doesn't have much difference. With the 28-300 lens, the center sharpness is also very good at the maximum aperture, which is 3.5, but I do see there is a little bit of glow between the highlight and the shadow area, which is something that doesn't exist with the 24-200 lens. The glow would disappear when I stop down to f5.6. And now let's look at the corner sharpness. With the 24-200 lens, the corner sharpness is pretty good already at the maximum aperture, and it becomes excellent at f5.6. With the 28-300 lens, the corner definitely is quite a bit softer at the maximum aperture 3.5, and it doesn't become sharp until I stop down all the way to f8. When I compare the corner sharpness of these two lenses, the 24-200 lens is definitely quite a bit sharper. Next, let's have a look at the results at 200mm focal length. With the 24-200 lens, the center sharpness is already very good at maximum aperture f6.3. Stop down to f8 would increase the center sharpness a little bit. With the 28-300 lens, the center sharpness is also very good at the maximum aperture, which is 5.6. Comparing the photos I've shot with these two lenses at f6.3, the center sharpness is virtually the same. Next, let's look at the corner sharpness at 200mm focal length. With the 24-200 lens, the corner sharpness is good at the maximum aperture f6.3, and it will improve a bit when I stop down to f8. With the 28-300 lens, the corner sharpness is definitely quite a bit softer at f5.6. Even stop down to f8, the corner sharpness is still not that much better. I have to stop down to f11 to actually get some good corner sharpness. So overall, I think in terms of the center sharpness, both lenses are very good. But if you look at the corner sharpness, the 24-200 is quite a bit better than the 28-300 lens. Both lenses do not have very beautiful Sunstars. Even when I stop down the lens, the Sunstar still doesn't look very nice. But if I have to pick a winner between these two lenses, I would pick the 28-300 as the Sunstar looks slightly better when I stop down the lens. In terms of vignetting, at the wide end with the 24-200 lens, at the maximum aperture f4, there is some strong vignetting, which improve when I stop down to f5.6, and it becomes not really noticeable once I stop down to f8. With the 28-300 lens, the vignetting is also pretty strong at the maximum aperture f3.5, and then it becomes much improved once I stop down to f5.6. When I compare the vignetting test photos that I shot with these two lenses, at the same aperture, the 24-200mm lens does have a little bit more vignetting compared to the 28-300 lens. I'm not too sure whether it's because of the 24-200 lens has a slightly smaller front filter thread and also the front element compared to the 28-300 lens. And let's have a look at the vignetting test photo that I shot at the telephoto end. With the 24-200 lens, at the maximum aperture f6.3, there is some minor vignetting, but once I stop down to f8, then vignetting is not really that noticeable already. With the 28-300 lens, the vignetting is quite strong at the maximum aperture f5.6. It becomes better when I stop down to f8, but there is still some light fall that is quite noticeable at the very corner of the frame, and I need to stop down to f11 to make the vignetting not really that noticeable. So if you compare these two lenses, at the telephoto end, I would say the 24-200 seems to have a little bit less, or at least more even light fall off that makes the vignetting not as noticeable as the 28-300 lens. Despite both of these lenses have a pretty complex design and a lot of elements, lens flare resistance and ghosting resistance seems to be pretty good with both of these two lenses. Even when I shoot directly into a very bright light source, I still get very minimal amount of lens flare and ghosting. Between these two lenses, I think the 24-200 does have slightly better lens flare and ghosting resistance. As both of these super zoom lenses, they don't have a very fast aperture, so bokeh is probably not the most important thing to look at when you are comparing these two lenses. But because the focal length, the maximum focal length can still be quite long, so you can still capture some shallow depth of field photo with the background blurred with either of these lenses. And the 24-200 lens has 7 curved aperture break, while the 28-300 lens has 9 curved aperture break. So on paper, the 28-300 lens should give you more rounded and smoother bokeh compared to the 24-200 lens. But when I look at my sample photos, I would say the bokeh quality from these two lenses are actually very similar. Even when I look at them side by side, I would say the bokeh from these two lenses, there is not much difference between them at all. In terms of distortion, if you look at this sample video, which I zoom in the lens with the 24-200 lens from the wide end all the way to 200mm, you can see there is not actually much distortion that is noticeable at all. But when I repeat the test with the 28-300 lens, I can see quite a bit of barrel distortion at the wide end with the 28-300mm lens, and then when I start to zoom in, it becomes pin cushion distortion. I do suspect the 24-200 lens almost no distortion result has something to do with the lens built-in lens profile correction, which remove a lot of distortion. Unfortunately, there's no easy way for me to turn off the distortion, especially when I take video. So if you know of some way that I can turn off the lens distortion correction, especially when shooting video, please let me know so that I can try that when I do the next test for the Nikon Z lenses. And when I was doing the distortion test, I also noticed both of these two lenses are not parfocal. So when I zoom in from the wide end to the telephoto end, the focus point would change a bit with both of these lenses. And if you like to capture some video using either one of these two super zoom lenses, I can tell you that the 24-200 lens has very minimal amount of focus briefing when I was testing it at the telephoto end. In comparison, the 28-300 lens has a lot more focus briefing and has actually pretty strong focus briefing when I repeat the same test with this lens. Okay, here you go. So these are all the test results I got when I was testing this 24-200 lens. As a super zoom lens, I think the image quality is really quite decent. The only thing that I don't really like is the quality of the Sunstars, which really doesn't look pretty at all. But apart from that, pretty much everything is as good as I expect or slightly better than I expected. Compare it with the 28-300 lens, you can easily see the improvement that Nikon has made it. For example, the corner sharpness is just a lot better with this new lens. There is a bit less lens flare, and also the distortion seems to be much better controlled. And if you are planning to shoot a bit of video as well, the autofocus on the 24-200 lens is definitely a lot better as well. It is virtually silent, and also the autofocus operation is a lot smoother. And also I was a bit surprised that when I found that there's virtually no noticeable focus briefing with this super zoom lens. If I have to pick one between these two lenses, I would definitely pick the Nikon Z 24-200 lens. I think there are probably only two reasons why someone might want to pick the 28-300. One is if they have to take a lot of photos at 200mm plus focal length, then this 28-300, because it can go all the way to 300, would be an advantage for those users. The other reason would be the 28-300 lens is about half a stop faster than the 24-200 lens. But consider how good the high ISO performance is with the latest camera, especially the latest full frame Z camera. I think that half a stop advantage is not really that important.